So we're pressed for time. So real quickly, I'm going to go right into introducing our panel. So today we have a couple folks with us who are going to do our presentation on restorative justice. First, we have Kelsey Sayers. Kelsey is the Associate Director of the Restorative Practice, Associate Director of Restorative Practices at the Center for Court Innovation. She currently oversees the restorative justice programming at the center's court-based site. Previously, she managed the day-to-day operations of the Restorative Justice in-School project. She's a former public defense attorney and a licensed social worker. So Kelsey, thank you so much for joining us. Next, we have Quilla Hugh. Quilla is the current coordinator of the Restorative Practice Department at the Center for Court Innovation. She spent the past 3 years working on the Restorative Justice in-School project as a senior associate, and is now working on a reentry program aimed at using restorative justice to support healing after long periods of incarceration. Quilla, thank you so much for joining us as well. Lastly, we have Erica Wright. Erica is a restorative justice facilitator with the Manhattan Justice Opportunities. There, she facilitates restorative practices as an alternative to incarceration in the Manhattan area. Prior to that, she spent 3 years working as a restorative justice coordinator for the Restorative Justice in-School project. Currently, she is completing her training as a clinical therapist and is also a certified school counselor. So ladies, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and proceed with your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to us today. So we're going to tell you a little bit about our project in New York City, Brooklyn, and hopefully it'll give you ideas about starting or improving your own project. Kelsey.
Hi, all. Kelsey, thank you for having us here today. Just want to make sure I can see the presentation. Sorry, give me 1 second. There we are. Sorry, give me 1 second. I'm trying to fumble. There it is. Okay, great. So just to give you a little background information about our project, the Restorative Justice in Schools project, it was led by the Center for Court Innovation here based out of New York City. So we worked inside of New York City public schools. So a little background information on New York City public schools, largest school system in the country. So there's about 1.1 million students. Our project was based out of the borough of Brooklyn, which just happens to be the largest populated borough in the city. We served 2 distinct communities and worked in 5 high schools. Our high schools had really high immigrant populations. They were known for having some of the highest suspension rates in the city. Demographically, New York City public schools overwhelmingly serve Black and Brown students, or almost 70% of New York City public school students are Black and Brown. New York City is also known to be one of the most segregated school systems in the country. Our schools primarily served Black students. So this is just some of the racial demographics for our students. In addition, to tell you a little bit about our student population and the needs, our student population was a pretty high needs student population. Most of our students were living in poverty and were eligible for free or reduced lunch. And this gives you a little information on sort of like the number of our students who had disabilities. We had one of our schools with a significant population of English second language learners. So that's just a little background information on the school. We spoke a little about restorative justice, so we don't have to spend much time talking about it here, but restorative justice is used in multiple different contexts, including schools, workplaces, within the justice system. Our particular project was inspired by the Navajo's peacemaking tradition. And with peacemaking, that's found in many different tribes and kind of reflects the unique culture and religion and collective experience of that tribe. A central focus of peacemaking is a focus on like problem solving and the emphasis of looking forward for the future. Just to give you a little bit of how we come to this work, our theory of change is that with strong relationships, you'll actually prevent violence. So that if we can build stronger relationships with the young people in school, it lessens the likelihood that violence will happen and that it will lead to a safer school community. Research suggests that If everyone you know is behaving in an antisocial manner, that you're more likely to behave antisocially. And I think the Navajo really understood that. So this maxim that we have here, he acts as though he has no relatives, is a belief from the Navajo that when someone acts wrongly, he has no relations, meaning that there are not enough people around him that he's connected with to hold him accountable. So for us, our theory of change really focuses on like positive social connections and like examining the root causes for why a behavior is happening, and then figuring out what are the supports needed to move forward and prevent that behavior. And what we really try to do is just like expand the conversation beyond what you would traditionally see in a school disciplinary system. So, we have the school approach is generally, what rule is broken, who broke the rule, and what's the appropriate punishment. Like that's how we essentially deal with antisocial behavior in a school context. The restorative approach takes a completely different lens, where the question is who was harmed. And when we say who was harmed, it's not just maybe the two students are involved in a conflict, but did this happen in a classroom? Did this affect like the classroom environment and the relationships that other students have in the school community? We also ask the question is, what do they need to heal and move forward? So we're not so focused on like what the punishment is going to be, but it's like what's needed to move the school community in a positive direction. And then lastly, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So to give you an example, in one of our schools, we had a situation where there were fights constantly happening in one particular hallway. And traditionally, the school deals with like the kids that are involved in a fight, they're going to have a punishment, they're going to get suspended, something's going to happen to those young people. And like with a restorative approach, our question was, okay, like who was harmed by this? And the entire school community is harmed. And also like, what do we need to do to move forward? So part of that is like opening the conversation to like why it's happening. So with a restorative approach, we're saying, well, this is all happening in this hallway. What's happening in this hallway? And by asking these larger questions, we're saying, well, this hallway definitely needs more school safety agents to be in this hallway because there's not enough supervision happening here, which is why it's likely that fights are happening here. It was also important for us for that particular hallway is that two of the teachers that were in the hallway were also having a lot of difficulty with classroom management. So that increased the likelihood that when kids were in conflict in their class, that it might break out into a fight. So by opening the conversation to just beyond what's the rule that was broken and how do we punish the students that are involved with the restorative process, we're really looking at who all is being harmed and whose obligation is it to make sure that we're moving forward in a positive way. So our approach for our project was really threefold. It was relationship building. When we say relationship building, we did that through circle practice. So we definitely use circles as an opportunity to build relationships and engage in pro-social communication and teach our kids about empathy and listening skills, but also just building relationships with all of the stakeholders in the school community. We were a little different because we were an outside community organization who came into the schools to do this work. So we had to spend a lot of time with just really building the trust of the members of the school community. And that's the students, the teachers, parents, administration. In addition to that, our second approach is really just responding to the needs of the community. And we did that through using circle practice. So we held a variety of different circles to deal with the needs in the school community. So we held response circles, and our response circles included support circles if there was a student in crisis or something that's happened in the school community. During our tenure in those schools, we had a couple of students that passed away. So we held support circles and grief circles in the school community, in addition to doing reentry circles. So if a student was away from school for a period of time, be that for suspension or sickness or something that was going on in that student's life, making sure that we're offering a supportive circle to bring them back. And then your traditional harm circle, where two students maybe got into some sort of fight, and now we're using the circle process to identify what they need to do to make amends, what they need to do to heal, and what they need to do to move forward. And then finally, the last part of our approach is really just like investing in our school communities. And when we say investment, we were investing our time and our energy, but also spent a lot of time thinking about what the school needed and like, is there ways that we can identify grants or identify programming that would really support the needs of the school community. So when our approach to restorative justice is we're doing the traditional restorative justice when people think about dealing with harm and conflict and issues in that school, but realizing that for restorative justice to be successful, it really has to be a positive school environment. And that requires more beyond the circle. That requires you to actively think about how to positively engage in positive school culture and climate, how to really meet the needs of your students. If your students have this overarching need, like we tried our best to really offer something to meet those needs.
So CCI was able to learn about peacemaking first in Cake, Alaska with some tribal leaders, and then brought together a whole round table, and we were able to be at that table to establish a base in peacemaking. But our team had the privilege of learning from Ray Deal and Sarah Whitehorse of the Navajo Nation, and then expanding from peacemaking and circle keeping. We also tapped some other circle practitioners as well as some school-based practitioners to understand how we mesh our understanding of restorative justice with our school. And some of the trainings we had, obviously I touched on a basis in peacemaking, storytelling. So much about restorative justice is like picking stories from your life to share, because we're modeling, right? And like sharing based on our own experiences. Self-care was really important part of this work for our staff. We wanted to make sure that they were given the time and space to reflect on what they best needed to take care of themselves. We had some teen dating violence come up, so we gave our staff plenty of training in that. And our trainings were twofold. So our team had a very intensive summer of training, and then we were in the schools for 3 years. But as things came up, we were giving our staff the trainings that they felt they needed. So what does all this look like in real time? And I'll pass it over to Erica now to tell you more about that.
Hello. Okay. So in our schools, it's important for us to note that we were put into schools that really had no idea that we were going to actually be there until it was closer to the time for the school year to start. So with that, we had to find ways that we could seamlessly integrate into the schools without imposing, because it was a DOE mandate and the schools did not volunteer to participate in the program. So we did a couple of things in order for us to build buy-in into our schools. So the first thing is that we started over the summer when it was just the teachers in. So before school actually started back up. So we hosted because we were in the 5 different schools, we hosted PDs for some of our teachers. Some of the staff in the building had kind of heard of RJ. Some of them had maybe even participated in a couple of trainings, but as a whole, we were able to come in to like do a PD with the staff so that we could introduce them to RJ. We also kind of helped out around the building. So if teachers were like getting prepared for the school year and putting things up in their classrooms, we just kind of offered any ways in which we could assist, like I said, so that we could become integrated as a part of the school building. We did coaching, like we coached the teachers if we were in their classrooms, helping them to run restorative justice sessions in their classrooms or the community building circles. We also hosted social outings. So we would have like happy hours that we would invite all the teachers to come to. And this was just a way in which we could build those relationships with the teachers, build buy-in, and for them to get to learn and to see who we were. We also supported like our students. So when school actually started and the students started to come in, we were very present in the hallways and we spoke to the kids. We would go to the cafeteria and we would bring in games. So like our program, we bought games for students if they wanted to play. So we had checkers and we had Uno cards, and we would sit at the tables with the students and actually play to them, because play with them, because that was a good way for us to, just have these just really good interactions with kids without, like I said, without us actually imposing. And from that, we were able to build a lot of trust, not only with the students, but also with the staff, because once the staff saw how much we were integrated with the kids and how much we interacted with them, that allowed them to, feel more comfortable with us, and also feel more comfortable with, if students were having difficulties, to allow them to come to us as people that they knew would be able to handle it. So modeling. In order for a restorative justice program to be successful, you have to be able to model it for everyone, not simply the practice of RJ of like holding circles, but the internal principles of RJ, having care, having genuine concern, like looking at it as a holistic approach for everyone that was involved. So the ways in which we did that, like I talked about a little, we had PDs with our teachers. So in our PDs, oftentimes we held our PDs like in a circle space, but we had different reasons for doing PDs. Some of them were like to let's continue to educate our staff on what restorative justice is, but also we wanted to, because in our schools in particular, a lot of our staff, they did not have really good relationships with each other. And many of them kind of stayed in their own classrooms, and there was not this community feel. And so we wanted to have PDs with our staff in which we could just talk about, like one of the circles that I ran was like a childhood circle. And we literally just oh, I'm sorry, just I was reading the note. We literally like talked about what was your favorite games that you played as a child, and the ways in which it really just brought out like, oh my God, I remember this. And in crafting these PDs with our staff, for instance, the one with childhood, it allowed them to kind of go back to their own childhood and also to relate to one another, but also to be able to relate to their students. Sometimes there can kind of be like a divide, especially if you've been teaching for a really long time. You just get in the mode of teaching, but this allowed them to be able to relate to, like, you know what, I was a kid one day. I mean, not one day, but I was a kid, a while ago. And so just like I said, to be able to kind of really have that, like that experience and to get to know their colleagues. We also did things to where like modeling, we brought in snacks. So a lot of our kids, because we live in New York, most students, they don't have school buses or like parents dropping them off. They take public transportation. And in some of our schools are located in parts of Brooklyn that were really far off. And often if they had a train, the train was at least maybe somewhere near a mile away from the school, or there was no train near the schools. And so they had to take the train and the bus. And we had kids that would come in from different boroughs. So oftentimes our students would show up late. And so they knew that they could come to us because we kept snacks. So like if you miss brunch, if you mixed breakfast, the kids could come to us and they can get snacks. The teachers also, we had snacks if the teachers wanted to come in, if they had a long day and maybe they didn't have something to eat or just needed a quick snack, they knew that they could come to us. And so it's just like the idea of just modeling like this community approach, this very holistic approach. And the last thing I'll say about modeling was, one of the things in our schools was, so for instance, the school that I work with, I worked really closely with the dean. She loved RJ, absolutely loved RJ. And she had done a couple of RJ trainings, but it's one thing to do a training, it's another thing to actually practice it. So what I would do with her is when we would have a conflict, and she would bring like students to me, or the principal would bring students to me, she would often sit in with me and just kind of watch how I interacted with the students, how I like the ways in which we prep with them, the questions that we ask. And she would be like, I really love how you ask that question, or like you're asking questions that I never would have thought of, because often in conflicts, they're like, what happened? Why did you do this? You need to stop. We would ask questions like a student would come in and I would ask like, what's your favorite? Let's say if I had two male students, I would ask, what's your favorite sports team? And that totally disarmed the students, and it would like get them to talking up. So whereas they came in on 10, I asked them these simple questions and it brought them down to maybe a 3. And then I asked like, you hungry? Like, did you eat today? They're totally unexpected. They're not expecting that. And I'm like, you want a snack? And first when they come in, I ask if they want a snack because they're mad. They're like, no. After I ask a few questions, you want a snack? Okay, I'll give them a snack. And it's like, we can then begin to like facilitate this conversation. And the dean was just like, I love this. Like, I see what you're doing here and I love it. So being able to have her sit in with me and being able to like model this was something that she was then able to take when she was interacting with students, and have that as a part of like her practice as the dean. So circles. The largest component of implementation is, outside of like creating an atmosphere of trust, the actual process of it is circles. So we did different types of circles. We had circles in our classrooms, and we also did harm circles. So in the classrooms, we had circles, in some of our schools, it was in our civics class. Some of the schools, it was in like the health or gym class. And some of our schools were able to implement advisory. Like I said, because we came into the schools very like late, close to when the school year was started, the principals did not always have the space or the capacity to create an advisory class for us to do circles. So they had to find ways in which we could do that. And so we would go into the classroom, once again, also thinking of that modeling, and work with the teacher on different topics that they would want to talk about with their students, or we would just come up with topics that we knew that the students wanted to talk about. And we talked about everything under the sun. And it gave students the opportunity to, one, be able to talk about things that maybe they don't get to talk about with the adults in their life. And they were able to do it in an environment in which like they felt relatively safe with us, because we created that environment. It also gave them the chance to like really kind of get to know their teacher outside of like, oh, you're just my teacher. They got to be humans. And this was a circle space, is a space in which students are allowed to be equals with the adults in the room. There is no I'm right, you're wrong. We're all one in this circle space, and we let that be known. Harm circles was something that we also did, because we were in the classrooms and we did have those community building circles. We were able to build an environment of trust, so that when conflict happened, we would get students that would come to us. Oftentimes it got to a point to where students would come to us before they even got to the point to where they were ready to fight. If they were just upset, they would come, oh, Miss Wright, I'm so upset, or like, and tell us what the conflict was. And we're like, okay, we get to talk to them, we get to calm them down, and then say, hey, are you wanting to talk to this person? I'm going to say 9.5 times out of 10, the students are like, yes, I want to talk to them. So then we could pull the other student, have a separate conversation with them in a different space about their side of the story to see what happened. And then ask them, hey, do you want to talk? Like I said, most of the times they're like, yes, I want to talk. We found out that our students, they don't really want to fight. They just want to be heard. And so we were able to bring the students together, like I said, in this circle space, so that everybody could be heard. Everyone had a voice. If they had like a friend or teacher that they had a really good relationship with to be their supporters, we would bring them into the space also. We also did this if there was a situation where it was a fight. You don't, in our handbook, the DOE here, even though a student may get into a physical altercation, you don't have to automatically go to suspension. So having a restorative process was a part of something that we could do. So if students had a fight, we did the same thing: pull the students in, speak to them separately, allow them enough space to breathe and to calm down. And once they were calmed down, ask, do you guys want to have a conversation? 9 times out of 10, probably more than that, they want to have a conversation even after the fight. And so we would, like I said, prep with them separately, bring in their supporters if they had supporters, people that they wanted to come in, bring in some of the staff who we knew had good relationships with the students, and sit them down together in this circle, in this harm circle space, so that they could talk about whatever happened. Because oftentimes, as you guys may know, if you work in schools, students get into a fight, even with teachers. We would have harm circles if a teacher and a student got into it, not necessarily a physical altercation, but if they got into an argument in the classroom. Oftentimes that happens. The kid gets kicked out of class. Maybe they may get suspended for a couple of days, and then they go back and they have to go back into their classroom. So us being able to have the harm circles was the opportunity for us to be able to bring together these people to say, okay, you're going to be in this space with each other. What is it that you need in order for you guys to move forward without there being like this tension between you? So we were able to do that with students, and we were also able to do that between students and staff. We also did reentry circles. So if there was a situation to where like a student was suspended, or even in some of our schools, students had been suspended maybe for like the year before we even got there, and they were coming into the school. So a reentry circle, we were able to bring them together with their parents. And also, like I said, if there was an adult in the building that maybe this student had a good relationship with, or just an adult in the building that had good relationships in general with the students, and maybe bring in another student to sit into this space to welcome them back into the schools. If a student was suspended and they're coming back, sometimes it's kind of awkward. And students, they like to save face, like, oh, I'm good. But you've been gone for a while and you don't know what happened while you were gone. So being able to actually re-invite the students into this space and to let them know, hey, there's no bad blood, there's no tension here, we welcome you, we want you to be here, is a really great way to, like I said, reintroduce them to the space. And it allows them to feel good about coming back here. So strength-based change. If you have a school that functions as a cohesive community, that is such a beautiful thing. However, we know that that is not always the case. So in schools where, for instance, like most of our schools, like I said, were very fragmented. Teachers stayed in their classrooms. Students were, you know, kind of here and there. We really didn't, like I said, we didn't just have like this communal space. So what we started to do was look at strengths-based change. What is it that our students are good at? What do they like to do? What are some things that the staff are good at? What are some things that they like to do? And this is also a recommendation that we give to people. Look at what your students and your staff in the building are good at. What do they like to do? And find ways in which you can offer space to do that. So for instance, as you see here, the students are playing soccer. That one of the teachers, which is actually the guy that's standing up more straight, he has on the white t-shirt, that was one of our teachers who he loved soccer. So in us kind of finding out about him, because we were in circle space in his classrooms, finding out that, oh, he really loves soccer. Okay, cool. Let's create this soccer club. So one of our colleagues worked with this particular teacher and they created a soccer club during like lunchtime. So the students who, because also like Kelsey said earlier, we had a lot of international students who were really big into soccer. And so they were able to come together during lunch a couple of times a week and they would have soccer club. It was also really great because that was used as an incentive to get students to like participate in other areas in school. So if the teacher had found out that the student was maybe skipping one of their classes or not doing really well at classes, like, hey, we want you to continue to be a part of the soccer club, but we can't have that if you're not showing up at class. You know, it's like it's a reward system. And so that was something that we were able to use to kind of, like I say, get students to really participate. We also offered, like I said, we had games that we would bring to the cafeteria, but also there were some students who didn't feel comfortable going into the cafeterias or didn't want to do that. And so we opened up our rooms and also like spoke with some of the adults and gave some of the teachers in the buildings games and different resources that they needed to be able to offer their rooms as a space for kids to come if ever they had free time, which was oftentimes like during their lunch. So this picture, we worked in schools where some of our schools were like 60% plus male populations. So a part of that strength base is looking at, we have these small populations of females who often feel isolated and they don't feel like their needs are being met because a lot of the resources went towards our male students because they were the main, you know, population of students. So one of the things that we did was we developed these girls groups. And so for some of our schools, we had girls group like during lunchtime, maybe like once or twice a week. Some of them we held the girls group after school, and it was just an opportunity to bring these young females together so that they could talk about, you know, whatever it was that was affecting them, and so that they could feel like they were a part of the school community. We also, one of the guys who was in our program, he ran an after school group called Men of Color, and he brought together like some of the male students, and they kind of talked about whatever it was, you know, that they felt like they needed to talk about. But like I said, it was just basically us looking at what the needs of these schools were and seeing how could we meet those needs. And a part of that is that, like I say, restorative justice, it's a community. It's about building community. It is about bringing people together. And so those are some of the things that we were able to do. This photo, the way in which the DOE is set up in New York City is that a lot of the schools are no longer like one large school. So you may have, or we have campuses. So within one campus that maybe a couple of years ago was like one school with 2,000 to 3,000 students, they've broken the schools down to be individual smaller schools within one campus. So for instance, this school right here that you see, it was 5 different schools within this one campus. So what we tried to do was, and because of that, there were a lot of rules set up about where students could be and like, you know, what parts of the building that students could utilize. And also the schools are really, the campus was really separated mostly with the adults because they were from, like, they were in all of these different schools. But the thing is that we oftentimes had students who went to separate schools on the same campus, but they were related. These kids went to they lived in the same households, they lived in the same communities with each other. And so we wanted to be able to try to develop like a one campus mentality within the schools wherever we could. So we tried to find ways to use these like communal spaces. So in the picture with the guy with the ball, this was like what did you call it? Like a corridor kind of area. where we would like be able to bring students together to like play games, or like they played soccer, or they would play frisbee. The one we see here painting the bench, we had a wood shopping class that was open to all of the students in the school. And so this is one of our colleagues, like she had her students, they built this bench for her so that she could put it like in her office when students came. So just really trying to take advantage of pre-existing programs within the schools to, like I said, build that communal process. And those are some of the other things that we were able to do.
There we go. Keep having to reload this quicker. So for community investment, we really approached this 3 different ways, taking advantage of what our community had to offer, trying to galvanize the community to pour into the schools and pour into our youth, and then advocating for our schools to just have more resources. So our schools were able to identify and form or strengthen partnerships with lots of community organizations that allowed us to better respond to the needs of the students. So one example is we worked with the mayor's office to end domestic and gender-based violence. Like I said, there was some IPV issues in our schools. So they were able to come in and train our teachers to identify, like to see the signs to identify if it was happening, and give some language for teachers to talk about this with students. Another school had a partnership with Global Kids, which is an org that does projects in different countries around health. And that was a school that had a lot of students that was interested in medical professions. Another school had lots of kids that were interested in various arts, but had no arts programming. So Urban Arts was an organization that could bring in art programming and after school clubs. So what's important there is like working cross sector to identify, like dream big. What does your school want? What does your school need? There are community organizations out there that we just have to partner with, and staff and people to like get involved. One example of how we did this is the picture here is of a school carnival. So we had private funding to throw a carnival. So we paid for the big inflatables and a few popcorn machines, but we were able to get the SSAs. They had a cotton candy machine and they came out. People from the mayor's office came out and tabled. Like we had a lot of organizations come out to table. They always want to get involved in communities and like go to fairs. And so they could bring fun stuff for the kids to do. And the kids could also learn a little bit more about all these programs that existed in their neighborhoods. Okay. There we go. So we also had a lot of students that were interested in recording songs, poetry, spoken word, and Erica mentioned the boys group Mike, Men in Color, and they had actually started a podcast, so they would have to trek all the way to our offices in the city in order to record. And so staff wrote a grant, and they won that grant amazingly to get a studio put in the school, right? So this is what we're talking about, like, also these schools need more resources, and like, how do we get those? So they were very lucky to get a recording studio. And in that recording studio, they continued to record their podcast, which won last year's NPR competition for Best Student Podcast with their climate change episodes. So also very, very proud of them. And all of these things matter because we're getting students out of their comfort zone. They're learning. So many of our kids like hadn't been outside of their neighborhood in Brooklyn and like hadn't been to other parts of Brooklyn. And like spending time with them and like doing that pre-work is what helps build our relationship so that they do come to us before they get into arguments and aren't getting into these fights. We also use a team approach in our work, so no one person can do this work alone. We had a team model. Because of our campus framework, we were able to have a staff person in each school, and then all those staff people could move across the floor to work on the campus. Similarly, In each school, we set up a RJ team to develop an implementation plan for the school and troubleshoot with staff as issues arose. So on the right side is a picture of our team, but on the left side is a picture of a specific RJ team in a school. So as you're doing this work, think about like who is doing this work in your school, who is going to be on the RJ team, who needs to be a part of the team to be able to make the decisions. We always like to start with a small team and then build out to like expand and bring more and more adults into the fold. We also thought very intentionally about how to invest in that team. So much of restorative justice work is a big emotional lift. So we wanted to create opportunities for community building among that team and to give them the time and space to care for themselves. We often say that like you give to your staff what you want them to be giving to your students. So we try to live by that.
Okay. Before I get into the assessment, there was something that I wanted to speak about. I kind of skipped over our SSAs, which are our school safety officers or school safety agents. In New York, we have it's a lot of them. And so there's been this big push and big question like lately about the role of school safety officers and or like what people say police in schools. And one of the things that we found was that although in our schools at the time, our school safety agents were like a subsidy of the NYPD, they were totally different. Most of our school safety agents, and I've worked in schools in a bunch of different cities, and this reigns very true for most of the places that I've been. Most of the agents that work in the schools are people who come from the community. They are in the schools that we work at. Oftentimes our agents had great relationships with the students. They knew these students' parents. They went to the schools that they worked in. They lived in the communities that they worked in. And so one of the things that we did, as opposed to like kind of trying to remove ourselves from them because of the stigma placed around these people as being like officers, we worked really closely with them because, like I said, they were some of the people in the schools that had the best relationships with the students. And so we also did a lot of professional development and had circle space with our SSA so that we could introduce them to what it was that we did, and also so they can like kind of give us some more of an insight of what their jobs were and some of the things that they struggle with within their jobs. And we worked really closely with them, and they were one of the greatest assets to us being within our schools. So I wanted to just make sure that I touched on that. With that, RJ is not all about conflict resolution. I know that RJ is a buzzword these days, and a lot of times it's dealing with how do we deal with crime and how do we deal with like punishment and things of the sort. RJ is about community, and you cannot participate in RJ for conflict if there is no standard of trust. And so one of the things with that is when we went into our schools, and these are some questions that you guys can also ask yourself, what is the leadership vision for the school? Because we were put into schools that we were not invited in, regardless of like what their vision was for their school, this was something that was kind of forced on them to have us in their schools. So what we had to do was work closely with our admin to see, with or without our presence in these schools, what is their vision and how can we support that vision? From that, we looked at the quality of the relationships in the building. In order to build an RJ community, like I said, there must be some sense of trust and or the ability to build trust. And how does that match the vision, and how does the vision of the leadership match up with the quality of the relationships between the admin and the staff, the admin and the students and the staff? And so those are some of the things that like we have to look at. From there, it's like, how do students perceive their schools? We know that a student's academic performance is often tied to them feeling like they are a part of a school community. And if your students do not feel like they are a part of the school community, you will have a school to where like violence is the norm, violence is the go-to. So once we know how a student feel about the schools, then we can start to work with the leadership and their vision and to really develop those relationships. And I'm not going to go through like all of the assessment questions, but also like what supports do our staff need? What supports do the students need? So like I said, with the strengths-based change, as far as us finding those things that our students really enjoy doing and that the staff enjoy doing, how can we support them? And a lot of that looked like what Quayla talked about, us getting outside funding. So for instance, to have the studio and to have the carnival that we did, because once again, our schools, although it's on one campus, we had some schools, 5 individual schools. And even in New York, there are some campuses where you may have 8 different schools within one building. And oftentimes, if, let's say, some schools share the same hallway, there's a dividing line and you don't cross that line. In these schools, if a student crosses a line over into another school, same hallway, they could be suspended or be like for trespassing. And so one of the things that we wanted to do as far as bringing students together with the carnival was to make this is for the whole campus. This is a chance for everybody to be able to come together. So it's like, what are the supports that they need? How do we build this idea of community and building like this one community? And so, like she said, we apply for funding to be able to support them, like to be able to support everyone in us creating this like one campus model. Tips for implementation. RJ work should be voluntary. In doing this work, think about the leaders in your school. Who are some of the people in your school that have the strongest relationships with the students and with the staff? And that sometimes could be a paraprofessional. It may not necessarily be a teacher. It may not necessarily be somebody that's a part of like the leadership team. Who has the strongest relationships across the school community? And those are the people that you want to really tap into. Those are the people that you want to really allow to kind of run these programs. Also with that, who are some of the people that maybe are the biggest critics of having RJ in the building, and bring some of those people on board too, because people learn by example. So if they see, you know what, I don't like this program, because we had so many teachers in our building that was like, I don't want to do this, because oftentimes a lot of teachers feel like I'm the adult and these are their kids. And so I'm not going to sit in a space with them and talk about like my life or talk about like what's happening with me. But once those same teachers see that the most problematic students in their classrooms are the students that we have the best relationships with, which, because that's typically how they work, they're like, wait a minute, what's happening? Because I've been working with this kid for 3 years now and we still bump heads. You all just came in, you've been here for 6 months, and this student is always wanting to go talk to you, and like you're able to calm them down, all of these different things. So once they see the impact of this, you bring in some of those critics, because those will be the ones that will be your greatest messengers for having RJ in your building, if you're able to convert them, because they see that like it actually works. Also, identify the voluntary settings where this will work. If you don't have the capacity, which also goes into like thinking about the school structure and limitations in mind, you have to think about what is the capacity of your school to implement RJ into the building. So if you have a school to where you can say, you know what, we already have an advisory, so maybe once or twice a week we're going to have circles in the advisory class. If you don't have advisory, and or if you are not able to implement advisory into the classroom, think about some of the other spaces that you can do that. Maybe they do have health class could be placed once a week. Or if you have like a student government, maybe within the student government you can have an adult that comes in and kind of teaches them the principles of RJ, and some of their meetings could be ran like in a circle, just so that students are getting they're getting exposure to this. Or if you have a peer mediation group, if they're not already doing like RJ or having circles or something, these are just different spaces where RJ can kind of be implemented into the school system. Also thinking about systems of accountability for all stakeholders. Oftentimes in schools, the only people that are held to task for the things that they do are the students. That is not building a restorative community, because we do know that oftentimes the adults are also causing harm to students. And so thinking about how we are facilitating conversations with everyone involved, and to say, like I said earlier, if there is a situation to where maybe a student is always having a problem with one of the teachers, or a lot of students, because I would have students come into my classroom all the time mad at the same teacher. So like, how do we hold that teacher accountable in a way in which we can have real conversations, and it's not where they're being punished, but like, hey, this is what's happening, this is what the students are saying, so that the students know that like they're allowed to be heard, and that their experiences are being validated. And so like I said, in thinking about that, we have to be able to hold everyone accountable, and not just the students in our building.
And I've hinted at this a few times, but we, in a few of our schools, had lots of cases of teen dating violence, and the regulations out didn't really provide much guidance on what to do or how to support the young people involved. So we worked with the administration in these schools to develop a restorative approach to IPV. This meant different things for different schools. So in one school, we developed and led a healthy relationships discussion series during advisory classes. In another school, we did the same thing, but after school. And that ended up becoming a club for students to talk about different relationship dynamics, either using themselves, or there's lots of different relationship dynamics in our celebrities that you can always reference. We also developed a campaign to educate students on IPV warning signs, and provide information on resources available to them if they were experiencing dating violence, or just things that they weren't comfortable with in their relationships and wanted to talk about. So really our aim there was to shift attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that enforce harmful gender norms and contribute to unhealthy relationships and violence. So it's really two things: supporting students on an individual level with specific needs, and then on a community level, having conversations around healthy dating habits. So thanks for listening to our long presentation. Happy to answer any questions. I know I saw some come through in
We
the
have one
chat.
question. Yeah, Quayla, we had one question around doing this virtually. So we did have some experience doing this virtually in our school. So I think the question was around talking piece. So I think you can, and Erica can jump in if you want to add to this. I think there are like two ways that you can do this in a virtual space. So we've had it where we ask everyone to have their own talking piece, and like they're lifting up the talking piece in their home that they're going to use when they're speaking. We've also done something where there's like a code word. I know Erica has used like abracadabra, and that means like I'm passing it to the next person, like a code word that wouldn't come up in normal conversation. So it's clear that you're passing it to the next person. When we've done them on Zoom, what we try to do is create a list of the order that we're going to go in, so that people know who's going to go next when you're not actually physically sitting next to someone in circle. So those are some of the approaches to sort of facilitating a circle process online. And I think you can do community building circles. I think you can also do harm circles online. It's a little different, and you got to kind of figure out what will work for your group of students, but we've definitely done it and had some success.
That's great.
Go ahead. The one other thing we've had is kids renaming themselves, like you just do your first name and then whatever number they are in the order, so no one forgets the order, and then you can go front ways and back ways.
Thanks. Awesome. Thank you guys for that. And thank you also, Kelsey, for responding to some of those questions in the chat. There was one question. Well, before I get to that, let me just say, applaud you guys for the podcast, right? I love that. And you know, what it must have took to get that studio in the school, I have no idea. But, you know, especially as a Black man, right? I tell this to members of my team all the time. It frustrates me so much when the first instinct is to like throw a ball in the hands of some of the kids that we serve, right? The youth that we serve. So it's so refreshing to see someone sit with youth and say, hey, what do you want? What are your interests, right? And it looks like by doing that, you guys came up with something super creative, right? And innovative. So applaud you guys for that. There was one question that involved sustainability, right? And I know, Kelsey, you had mentioned that this is a 3-year funded project, which is awesome. But I also wanted to find out, like, what on the front end, what can you do, or what have you guys done on the front end to ensure that, you know, by the time you get to that, you know, year, 2.5, 3-year mark, that there is some semblance of sustainability with some of the work that you folks are doing?
So I think when we talk about having a team approach, that was a big part of it. And we actually did a write-up on our project. So hopefully that will be published soon, and we can definitely pass it on to you all once that is published. But we created an RJ team in every school. And I think that it looked different depending on the capacity in some schools. So some schools sort of had a formal RJ team, and like there's an admin on it, and there's a teacher on it, and, you know, union and like a formal team that you would see in the school. And there are other schools where it's like, this is the 7 adults in the school who are really committed to doing this work. And they're going to meet regularly and talk about how do we bring other adults in the fold. So I think for us, a big part of it was just like identifying what version of an RJ team could be supported by that school community. And that was really successful in terms of making sure that we spread the work beyond our team so that they were adults and individuals in the school after our grant was no longer funded that could continue to do the work.
That is really great. Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Hi. Like when it comes to circle practice, we are very intentional of like always trying to co-facilitate with the teacher. There are plenty of days if we're out sick, they can fully facilitate their own circle, and trying to have that be a practice that's sustained. So when we leave, hopefully if there's time for them to co-facilitate with another teacher, so that people are always getting that practice, because I know it's a thing. We had lots of high turnover in our schools. So it's nice if you train a whole bunch of teachers, but then next year, if half your teachers are gone, now you only have half that's trained. And like, I don't know, we have lots of formal training, but like Erica said, so much of RJ is about just the doing. So if you can get people doing, you're good.
And I would also like to know, like, sustainability is difficult, especially like we were an outside project. We were not, you know, funded through the schools. And so the realistic aspect of this is that sustainability works great when schools have the funding to be able to do this. So if you can have a full-time restorative justice person in the schools, but also having to understand that one person in the school doing this work, it's an extreme amount of emotional labor. And so how are they also being supported? And so like Kelsey said, having that team, but also having one person in particular, like that is kind of like the forerunner of restorative justice in the schools. And all of our schools, like we were that person. So once you remove us, you don't actually have that. So schools being able to actually put the funding to be able like to do that. And then also like, you know, they send the staff to trainings. Well, when they come back from the trainings, are the schools given them the capacity and the space to actually practice the things that they train? Because you can go and you can have a weekend long, or you can go for 6 weeks, you know, every Friday you go and you do an RJ training. But if you come back into the building and then you don't actually have the space to practice what it is that you're learning, it really doesn't, you know, it's good optics, but it's not real. So actually, the administration in the school has to be able to give people the space to make this as a practice and allowing it to become an ethos of the schools. And so, like I said, in order for that to be sustainable, it has to, there needs to be funding behind it, and there needs to be, the administration needs to like back it up, not just say, okay, yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to allow you guys to do that, but then we're not going to really like be invested. So like it has to be a real like investment, just like they're invested in, you know, test scores and like what are we doing for these tests. It has to be the same amount, because you're thinking about RJ is an alternative to like discipline, but in the sense it is creating a system in which like discipline is not needed so heavily. But we know that in schools are heavily disciplined. So how can we build infrastructure in these schools that will allow for this to become just a part of what we do?
I think to answer the question around the RJ teams that didn't have admin, so because we were there, even if an RJ team didn't have admin, we were having ongoing conversations with what Erica alluded to with the administration about what are the ways that the administration is like supporting this work? Like this can't happen without administration. Like people need time in their schedule to be able to facilitate circles. Like you need resources, you need a classroom. Like in our schools, a typical class had 30 students. You can't host a circle with 30 students. So if you want to do RJ circles this period, do you have 2 classrooms and 2 adults that we can split this group in half? So even if admin doesn't sit on an RJ team, there definitely has to be a direct conversation happening with admin with like the needs of like RJ implementation so that they're aware of the ways that the administration has to support it for this work to be successful.
Yeah, and it sounds like you need that buy-in, right? That's what it's all about. You really need a commitment more than just saying, hey, we have a cool program we want to set up. Folks have to put some skin in the game, right? So one of the questions that I had, and then we'll go to one of the questions that was listed in the survey, but just around wraparound services or additional components to what you folks provide. One thing that was mentioned earlier that really stood out to me was obligation to meet the need, right? And so I'm wondering, like, when you're in these circles, or even if you're just conversating with a student and you're hearing the need for additional supports in specific areas, what does that look like? And also, can you talk a little bit about developing community partnerships with different organizations that could also help to supplement some of the work that you do?
I would say it depended on the schools. So for us, is if something came up in Circle, we were very much interested in like, is there someone in the school that we can connect this young person to? And I think one of the benefits is working for the Center for Court Innovation, which is such a large organization. We were also able to like refer out just within our own agency that had a lot of support for youth. But if I'm suggesting this to a school, I think it's being mindful about the community partners that are around you or are interested in working in your school. And there are often a lot more community partners than people are aware of that would like to be able to work with young people. So I think we spent a lot of time sitting back and saying, like, are there programs already out there looking for schools? Can we bring them in? So the example that Quayla gave was, we're having all of these issues with intimate partner violence with young people, and the mayor's office has an entire curriculum where they will send people out from the mayor's office for free once a school requests it to do a training across the school for young people around intimate partner violence. So I think like listening to what those needs are and then figuring out, is there someone I can connect them to? If there isn't someone that can connect them to, is there something that maybe we can think about for applying for a grant, and just being open to that? And then utilizing the resources that are in your school, whether that's your school social worker, your school psychologist, really utilizing them and bringing them into the fold for the RJ process. I know James put a question in the chat around the results. We're hoping that this summer, like our official research results will be published. So I didn't talk much about this, but our project was funded by the National Institute of Justice as a part of the School Safety Initiative. So it was a research-backed grant. It was a randomized controlled trial. So when Erica talks about the schools not knowing, they had no idea. We basically showed up a month before school and was like, congratulations, you were selected for this randomized controlled trial. I hope you like RJ. We're gonna be living here for 3 years. And that's basically how we landed in the schools, but we're hoping our research should be out this summer. We can tell you anecdotally that we had schools that went from an 80% drop in suspensions by our last year. And I don't think we sprinkled any magical dust. I think that we built relationships with the kids. We said the lunchroom was a hot spot. If there's only 3 adults in the lunchroom and 300 kids, this is probably gonna be a place where fights happen. It's hot in this lunchroom. There's no drinkable water. Let's spread the kids out around the school. Let's start lunchroom clubs so everyone doesn't have to be in the same space. Let's bring them games. And just all of these things that I think in the abstract, when we think about stopping kids from fighting, you're not necessarily thinking about those things, but they play a huge role on like whether a fight is likely to start. And like, let's be an adult where a kid can come in and probably not use the best language about how upset they are. And we say like, okay, calm down. Like, how can I help and support you? Because we don't want you to get into a fight. But yes, that research should hopefully be out this summer.
And Kelsey, as I was hitting the enter button, I was like knocking myself on the head, because I remember one of the things that stood out in your podcast was a comment that I can't remember who said it, was that, people hear this, and Oscar, you talk about, hip language. Restorative justice is now the hip language. And, we sprinkle a little bit of the restorative justice fairy dust and boom, we're going to have magic appear. But, I think what you all have heard is that there's a ton of work that goes into it before, and it's not sprinkle fairy dust.
I see a question here from Oscar.
amazing.
So I think part of what was interesting about our research study is that when we came in to do this research study, New York City was already doing a larger push for RJ in schools. It was a very different model from our model, where we came in with staffing. So part of our analysis will be comparing our schools to like the DOE schools that basically just got training and like no additional staff or no additional funding to do anything extra. It's just like, we're going to train the teachers in this school to do RJ, and then compared to schools that got no RJ. So hopefully like the comparison across the 3 different groups will really give us some like insightful information about like how to improve school culture and climate in schools that are often very difficult. Like we were placed in schools with like some of the highest suspensions in the city. And it's like, you can make a change in that school. That change is not just putting kids in a harm circle. That change is like culture change. That is where the change really is. It's not on the individual levels, like how do we build better community across this school? How do we change the culture of this school where the norm isn't to react that way? And I know we haven't talked about SEL at all in our presentation, but like at the heart of what RJ is doing is really building those social emotional skills with the young people in circle practice, in a restorative chat, in dealing with their issues. So I just want to throw that out there. We don't talk about it in like the formal SEL way that I think a lot of curriculums talk about it, but RJ definitely has a huge component in that when we're teaching kids how to listen, how to have empathy, how to stop and take a breath and take a moment. It's all a part of those social emotional skills that we all understand is so important for a young person's development.
And this is
And
Oscar.
on that,
Oh,
sorry, go for it,
okay.
Oscar.
No, I was going to say that, first of all, thank you for the amazing presentation. And I think additionally with your research studies coming out, I don't know if it's in your findings section or what have you, but I would highly recommend that you have something that highlights your personality and that right fit, because I can tell by the team being in school system that you are probably quite unique. And that part of what's making this move is your ability to navigate, all of the different things that's been thrown your way, whether it's the organizational microaggressions or even dealing with having to bring in something so awesome and convince people that they want it. And Oakland, I'm just assuming by this point, everybody is celebrating the results, but not necessarily talking about all that other stuff that happened at the beginning. So I hope something's in there for our readers to be able to say that when you pick the right people, make sure that personality, don't just line that you look at personalities, but also look at the people that you bring in, their social capital and everything. But thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions people have? Feel free to unmute. One more quick question, and again, this came from our survey. Kelsey, thank you for hitting on the SEL because that was one of the questions that were mentioned as well. This is one of the things, we all, I'm sure, love about restorative justice programs is just what I mentioned from the outset, how diverse they are, how different they are. This is an in-school program, right? But how do you include, if at all, community restorative justice, juvenile justice, police departments into your work at school or in school? This was one of the questions from the survey.
I think it's really related. And I think that the center learned how to do this work outside of schools. We were actually the first center-based project to be housed in a school. Most of our work with young people comes from outside of the school setting, like in a community setting. So for us, I think the model is a little bit different when you're in a community setting than when you're in a school, but I think that they work together because at the same time, we definitely partnered with organizations that were like outside of our school that were, in addition to the work we were doing with the young people in school, also linking them to resources and doing things related to restorative practices at a community site. So when we talk about the podcast, initially, before we got the funding for the studio at our school, we were at a partner organization that had a music studio. And that's where our kids were traveling to record their podcasts initially. So I think that it's very similar work. I think it has to do with what I think Oscar's talking about, is people who are like passionate to really build relationships. And I think that, yes, it helped that our staff was younger. I think there's lots of things that worked in our favor, but some of the best advocates and some of the people who had the best relationships in our schools didn't look anything like our staff. Like, they were seasoned teachers who had been in that school for a long time, and they were just really interested in having positive relationships with young people. And I would say that they were doing RJ before we got there, and we were really able to elevate their work. We had one teacher that, like, he had a gaming club in his classroom at lunch, and it was a fight with his admin originally because they didn't want any kids upstairs during lunch. And he was kind of like getting in trouble because he saw a space for a group of young people who really just needed a space. So I would say that, yes, like, personality happens is like important, but I think that every school has that group of individuals who are already doing that work. And if you can find a way to elevate those people, support them, and make it a part of the mainstream culture of the school, is where you're going to have success. Like, our success had to do with the fact that when we got to the schools, we looked around, we said, well, who's already doing this? How do we work with them? How do we elevate them to make this mainstream in the school?
Outstanding. Any other questions before we wrap? All right. Kelsey, Erica, Quayla, thank you so much. Really appreciate you guys. Did a super job. Love the presentation. I'm going to throw it back over to James.